Thank you, Katie, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Las Vegas. Your agenda says that I was supposed to be on at 11 o'clock, but I've done a few of these before, so I actually had 11:07 as my exact starting time, believe it or not. So I've already won my first bet of the day. So, good, I'm glad this is a gambling crowd. I was afraid I wasn't going to land. What are we going to do? I have a presentation that I'm hoping is going to come up any minute now. I may have lost that bet. There you go. That's going to talk about the S in ESG. Right? I was very happy to hear Stefan talk about how much this show values sustainability and how important it is for this industry. We've all heard ESG as sort of a common acronym and way of holding industry accountable. I'm here to talk to you about the S, the social part of environment, social, and compliance, and in particular, the evolving landscape of that S in this era of mandatory human rights due diligence that we are entering into. As Katie mentioned, I am the president and CEO of WRAP, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. We're a social compliance certification organization, and so for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this landscape, and then, as she said, hopefully have time for Q&A. But I wanted to begin very briefly with an overview of the organization, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with WRAP. I'm not here to pitch WRAP, although what kind of CEO would I be if I waste a captive audience, right? But I think it's important for you to have some context for my remarks, so understand where my come from is. And then we'll dive into the substance of the discussion, beginning with a quick tour into the origins of this idea of social compliance, social audits, which is really a relatively new institution, and even newer still, this era that we're in, that of mandatory human rights due diligence. What does that mean, and how did we come to find ourselves in this space? Then the main question, all right, now what? How do we navigate this evolving landscape? I'll have a quick remark or two for conclusion, and as I said, Q&A, generally my favorite part of these sessions. All right, let's start quickly with the overview of WRAP. As I mentioned, we are a factory-based social compliance certification program. In fact, we are the world's largest independent such organization that's focused on apparel and footwear and sewn products and related industries. I know there is a cross-section of industries represented in the room today. We made the choice to focus on the one that is really the most labor-intensive of the manufacturing sectors because we feel that we would bring more value being deep experts in this space rather than trying to be shallow and take on all comers. Our industry focus may be limited, but our geographic focus is not. The W stands for worldwide. We certify and inspect factories all over the world, the entire planet where there is manufacturing for apparel. Mostly, as you know, this would be out in Asia, but we do have factories, as I said, all over the world. This is kind of the descriptor para of the organization. We are an objective, nonprofit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are. What we do is promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing throughout the world. That's our mission. That's kind of what we do. And how we do it, our primary offering is that certificate. We inspect the factory, and if they meet our standards, we issue a certificate that the factory then gets to show their prospective clients, the brands and retailers around the world, as validation of them being kosher to do business with. So that's our primary offering, our main product. And we also believe very much in educating the space, right? That's why I'm always looking forward to opportunities like this to talk to leaders of the industry and spread the gospel of compliance, as it were. And talking to industry in particular is very important to us because we believe that that's the space to engage with. We are a nonprofit, we're an NGO, but we're not an activist organization. I'm not here looking to find someone to put a pie in the face of. I'm here to talk to industry and educate the space and sort of recognize how it is to our mutual benefit in our own self-interest to take social compliance seriously. And as such, we position WRAP as a program of choice for industry associations. And in fact, in this country, the apex trade body for the apparel space, as some of you may know, is the AAFA, the American Apparel and Footwear Association. And we're very proud at WRAP to be the official CSR partner, corporate social responsibility partner of the AAFA. I won't delve deep into this slide. It just tells you at the headline level what the RAP principles are, what are the things that we are measuring factories against when we inspect them. And I mentioned we are worldwide. I'll just sort of locate us on the map. We're headquartered in the DC area, just outside in Arlington, Virginia. We have offices in Hong Kong, as well as in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, so the top two apparel exporting countries of the world. We also have full-time staff covering all the rest of the world, even if we don't have brick and mortar offices there. For Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, we have somebody based in Europe. We have 3 people in India, and 4 actually spread out in various Southeast Asian countries. And as of earlier this year, a full-time person in Pakistan as well. So we are where the factories are. We have a resource on the ground for them to call up during their working hours, dialing a local number, talking to somebody who speaks their language, understands their laws and their culture. I'll just have one more sort of brag slide for you. I mentioned we're the largest program out there. I want to back that up with some numbers. Those are our top 10 countries and the number of factories from each one. No surprise, it tracks the top apparel exporting countries in the world. Last year, we received just under 3,500 applications, 3,497 to be precise. And it was still a coming out of COVID year, so we were very proud of that performance. As of right now, end of the 3rd quarter of the year, there are just over 3,400 factories with a current RAP certificate in 42 countries around the world. Altogether, they employ a little bit north of 3.4 million workers. So we have a pretty large footprint that we are quite proud of. All right, so let's talk about the origins of social compliance and build into this era of mandatory due diligence. They emerged in the late 90s and early O's, or early 2000s. I still don't know what we call that decade. The aughts? Whatever, those years. When the industry was moving sort of permanently away from the old owned and operated models to the now predominant outsourcing model. And in that process, recognizing that a lot of visibility into supply chain was being lost. So in the 90s, activist organizations, human rights organizations, exposed a lot of supply chain challenges in the form of sweatshop conditions in factories that were resulting not because these brands and retailers were actively seeking bad factories. Find me the factory that employs kids and beats them up. I want to place an order there. No, they just weren't doing a good enough job checking as to what was going on. And the result was these exposés that really hurt brands and retailers and woke them all up to the reality of needing to do due diligence voluntarily as part of their business processes. But the problem was we got off on the wrong foot. Because of that negative impetus, because we were trying to protect the brand, kind of was the reason why we were doing this, the space became an us versus them type of a situation where buyers and manufacturers saw each other as adversaries. The brand had to protect its reputation against the bad factories, right? There was no partnership approach to good practices. It was more of a policing function with responsible sourcing rules, codes of conduct promulgated by brands and retailers being imposed upon the factories. It was like a one-way directive. You want to do business with me, you got to follow these rules. It wasn't like there was a partnership. And if that wasn't bad enough, this sort of us versus them mentality, it got worse because brands and retailers all felt like they had to go do their own checks on their own suppliers, using their own codes with their own auditors, and storing the data in their own proprietary systems. And as you know, with outsourcing models, these factories aren't exclusively dealing with one brand. They have 8, 10, 16, 20 different buyers. And that meant that if you were that good a factory, you had to have 8, 10, 16, 20 different audits, which was not a viable proposition. All these things cost money, they take time. And so in the 2010s, now there's a decade with an obvious name, right? There was an attempt to harmonize all these codes. We can't go out there reinventing the wheel. Can we find a way to do it all together, the same way? And all those attempts failed. And they failed for one fundamental reason. They all made the mistake of trying to come up with a single size solution. And this industry, better than most, understands that sizing matters, right? One size does not fit all. Different players are in different places of their supply chain journeys and their levels of maturity and their ability to engage with their suppliers. So coming up with just one way of doing things was doomed to fail. and they all failed. And the result is that audit fatigue today, this term of too many audits, is a true scourge. And it's only going to get worse, as you'll see when we talk about this era of mandatory human rights due diligence that we are now entering. Right. When supply chain due diligence started to become a voluntary activity that businesses undertook, governments in all the major consumer markets also started to pay attention to this practice. But initially, their oversight, was limited to the companies at the headquarters level, looking for their behavior throughout the supply chain. And while it took various forms, some laws were passed, regulations, trade policy, and the like, historically the trend in the 10s and leading up to the early 20s was public disclosure laws. They weren't telling companies what they had to do. They were simply saying, whatever it is you're doing, you have to report to us what you're doing. The California Supply Chain Transparency Act is a good example. The UK and Australia Modern Slavery Acts likewise fit that mold. Other jurisdictions took similar laws on the books as well. So there was no requirement to do something. Whatever it is you were doing, just tell us. That's the lay of the land as of 3 years ago. But in the 20s now, we started to see increasingly laws being considered that not only required reporting, but actually insisted on active duties that had to be met. And if they weren't, there was going to be concurrent liability. So you can't simply say what you're doing. You must actually audit. You must actually correct. You must actually remediate. And then you have to report as well. That wasn't going away, but it wasn't just reporting anymore. And those laws are what we call mandatory human rights due diligence laws that are primarily coming up of Europe. So Deliver is very familiar with them, I'm sure. There's one of the books in Germany already, and an EU-wide one is currently making its way through Parliament. And they, as I said, are now getting enforced with serious attention being paid to actual behavior as opposed to simply reporting behavior. I'm going to move a little faster so that we get caught up and we have time for questions. I put this up here and I won't go into it, but this is how complicated the landscape is becoming. Right? And this is from 2 years ago. They haven't even updated this slide yet. But you can see there's a whole series of laws that are now on the books or emerging, a whole bunch of guidelines and a whole bunch of sort of soft law things from the UN and the OECD that speak to supply chain behavior that makes the consequence of this much more serious, with NGOs campaigning in favor of these laws and brands and trade associations being forced to react. The bottom line is that it is today increasingly clear that effective supply chain social compliance due diligence, that's a mouthful, let me repeat that, effective supply chain social compliance due diligence is a necessary part of doing business. It's no longer voluntary, it's no longer a nice to have. You must do this if you want to be able to stay in business, because you don't want regulators targeting your company and you don't want consumers shunning your product. So how do you navigate this landscape? No more, let's just do it one way. We've seen those efforts have all failed. They're all doomed to fail. One size does not fit all. We need an approach that allows everyone to move at their own pace. And that approach exists. Credible independent programs like RAP are out there. And I would submit that efficiency in supply chain management now becomes even more important because it's mandatory. So you have to do this, and if you have to do it, you have to do it in a way that is most cost effective. Don't reinvent the wheel. Avoid audit fatigue by making sure that brands, retailers, buyers benchmark their proprietary programs against a standard like RAP, and you'll see that there's 100% overlap. There's nothing the brand is looking for that we're not going to be checking for, and we get to do so as an independent organization, right? Ask yourself what percentage of your current suppliers are already in that program. As I said, we have over 3,500 factories in RAP. Odds are you're already working with a factory that's in there. Don't make them repeat an audit when you can get that data independently and in a much more cost-effective fashion. Check how they result, the match up with yours, and here's the kicker. You running your own program involves costs. It's an overhead for you, right? Measure that and see how much it actually is a drain on your own systems, let alone on the costs being imposed on your factories that are having to go through multiple audits. And manufacturers, because of that wrong foot start, have always felt they don't have much agency in this. They should push back. Push back against buyers who insist on their proprietary programs and say, why? Why do you need to do that? Here's a RAP certificate, here's an independent assessment that gives you the data. Take that, don't make us waste time and money going through another inspection. So to conclude, we are in an era of enhanced due diligence. Europe is taking the lead. We're not too far behind here in the US. Various individual states have already got laws they're debating that would very much look like mandatory human rights due diligence laws. Because legislation is now mandating these things, as opposed to leaving it as a voluntary activity, the need for cost-effective approaches becomes that much more obvious. And there's no more justification for wasting time, energy, and resources by the imposition of proprietary audits by brands and retailers. The solution is to utilize the handful of existing independent programs like RAP that are out there, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel each time and insisting on duplicative proprietary audits. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much for your attention. Really appreciate it. Back to you, Katie. I'll sit over here.
So,
You want?
yeah.
I'll give you the center.
All right. I love being in the center. So in the interest of time, I think let's go straight to the audience and see if anyone in the audience has questions. Otherwise, I have plenty right here. Are you raising your hand right there? No?
If this was an auction, we'd have our first bid already.
Yeah. No? Quiet audience? All right. Well, I'm never shy, so I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Okay, so you talked about efficiency in your presentation. Operational efficiency aside, what are some of the cost efficiency implications of reducing audit fatigue in the ways that you described?
Well, that's a great question, Katie. There are both operational and cost efficiencies, absolutely, because if you're running your own program internally, then you have that overhead cost that I talked about, that you have to hire these people, you know, their benefits, you know, their travel, all of that. Plus, you're the one that is tasked with the necessary follow-up that the laws now mandate that you undertake with these factories, corrective actions and you know, double-checking that they've met the corrective actions. So all of those are costs and obviously operational challenges.
Right.
If you use an independent program, then you don't need that overhead. And more importantly, that follow-up stuff is done by the program, especially if it's a certification program like RAP. It's not simply an audit report you're getting that you then have to figure out the tail of. And that itself is, again, an operational saving, but also, very importantly, a cost saving, because you don't then have to have as being an overhead. You should always have people on your team that act as an oversight with the program partner, but you're not going to need to staff up, you know, 20 auditors in-house, because you're using that independent facility as a cost and operational saving.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. Apparently this Las Vegas air is getting to me.
Yes,
are there any other questions that were spurred out in the audience? Otherwise, I have one more question.
I'm just curious as to your thoughts on how far the U.S. is behind Europe. You said obviously it's not a one-size-fits-all, but what are some of the challenges that you see the U.S. facing to catch up to Europe in human rights due diligence?
That's another great question. And I don't think the U.S. is behind in terms of, like philosophically, right? It's not like we are more tolerant of bad behavior in the U.S. than they are in Europe. It's just that from a legal perspective, what we have in the U.S. is a very, very old law dating back to the 1930s, actually, the U.S. Tariff Act, 19 U.S.C. 1307, if those of you are legally minded, that bans the importation into U.S. of products made with forced or prison labor. So they can be withheld at the port of entry. What we don't have is a law like the European, sort of the German Supply Chain Diligence Act that mandates that a German entity, or an entity doing business in Germany, doesn't have to be a German entity, has to do audits on their supply chain and has to correct mistakes or non-compliances found. So in the US, the laws that we have on the books are still more reporting laws rather than actually you must act laws. That's the difference. But already in New York, for example, there is the New York Fashion Act that's not yet a law, it's been proposed, that would impose those requirements. And there are other states that are looking at similar laws. inevitably there'll be a federal version of some sort because business does not want to have 50 different laws to deal with. They'd rather have that one law there. So we are all against forced labor. We're all against child labor. We're all for good human rights due diligence. The Europeans are mandating it through active measures in the law. The US has protective measures, but we haven't yet got those kinds of laws on the books yet. So that's the difference, the only difference.
Super. So I think, unfortunately, we're out of time.
I figured.
So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to approach you after the fact.
I will be around.
All right.
Thank you all very much.